Welcome to the Daily Report. It's Friday, April 1st here in Korea. There has been a further ease in social restrictions as we seek a better adaptation to life amid COVID-19. Here first are the pandemic tallies. So let's begin here on the local front then.
Sunny, alongside the ease in social distancing measures, the number of COVID-19 infections has dropped, and that to below 300,000. 280,273 cases were tallied in the span of 24 hours as of 12 a.m. this Friday. And with that, the average number of daily cases in the past week now stands at a little under 320,000. And also this Friday's figure marks a drop from last Friday by roughly 60,000. And now let's move over to our map. There's been an increase in cases in some places, but most of them are seeing a drop. And the numbers are ranging from around a little under 3,000 to a little under 76,000. And there are some places that have hit some milestones this Friday. Now, as of this Friday, Gyeongsangbuk-do province has surpassed the 500,000 mark in cases, and Gyeongsangnam-do province over 800,000, while Busan has hit the 900,000 mark in total cases this Friday. And now let's also take a look at the death toll. 16,590 people have lost their lives due to the coronavirus, and that's 360 added in the past day, and the total number of infections stands at a little under 13.4 million. On to the number of patients in severe or critical condition. This number has slightly dropped from the day before. Moving on to our vaccination figures, we've got roughly 4,500 and 3,300 people who have been administered with their first or second dose of a COVID-19 vaccine or are considered fully vaccinated, while around 31,000 have been inoculated with a booster shot, and that's now 63.8% of the nation's population. Now, worldwide figures, meanwhile, we're seeing a little under 1.5 million new infections reported in the past 24 hours as of noon Korea time, with a little over 4,600 COVID-19 related fatalities. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for those tallies over the past 24 hours. Up next, Chair Min-jung joins me now with details about Korea's latest ease in social restrictions, which will be in place starting next week. Min-jung, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sunny.
Right, so tell us about the latest rollback in restrictions here.
As you mentioned, Sunny, social distancing measures will be relaxed starting next Monday. Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum announced Friday morning that social gathering caps will be raised to 10 people from the current 8, and business hours will also be extended by an hour to midnight. This will apply to venues including restaurants, cafes, singing rooms, bars, as well as indoor sports facilities. There had been talks on completely scrapping business curfews, but Kim explained that the lifting of measures should be done gradually, given the uptick in severe cases and the rapid spread of stealth Omicron. The eased measures will apply for 2 weeks starting on Monday, and many pundits expect them to be Korea's last round of social distancing measures, given the downward trajectory of the Omicron wave. And Kim also added that if the outbreak stays under control over the next 2 weeks, authorities will take more determined actions. Let's take a listen.
We will make bold changes to restrictions if our medical system remains stable over the next 2 weeks, with fewer severe cases and deaths. We will promptly adjust our healthcare response in accordance to the latest virus situation. And if the majority of COVID patients can get treated at local clinics and hospitals, I believe Korea can become the first country in the world to declare an endemic state.
Kim's statement comes following the Wall Street Journal's report on Korea's pandemic response, which it described as successful. Like we touched upon yesterday, the journal reported that Korea could become the first country to transition into an endemic stage of COVID-19. The paper quoted U.S. infectious disease expert Monica Gandhi, who said this is mainly because the country has, quote, one of the highest vaccination rates among adults, high trust in the public health system, and the right tools to emerge from the pandemic. The journal pointed out that Korea is at the leading edge of countries in Asia, despite new infections in March being 3 times higher per capita than the peak of the Omicron wave in the U.S. and the UK.
Min-jung, also starting today, that is Friday, fully vaccinated travelers into the country arriving from any part of the globe, I understand, face no quarantine. Tell us about that.
Right, Sunny. Starting April 1st, all fully vaccinated travelers arriving in South Korea will be exempt from quarantine. This means no matter where you come from, you will not have to isolate for 7 days. The same rules had been in place from mid-March, except for those arriving from Myanmar, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan. But now, everyone who is fully vaccinated can enter the country without exceptions. Being fully vaccinated means that 14 days must have passed since getting the last dose of your vaccine regimen, but not more than 180 days. Those who have gotten booster shots are also recognized as being fully vaccinated. In line with this measure, Incheon International Airport is reverting back to pre-pandemic operations. Quarantine information booths and separated areas for inbound travelers have been taken down. Disinfection personnel have been removed, and people can now buy tickets for public transit at the airport. Until now, inbound travelers had been restricted from using buses and subways.
Right, Minjung, they had. Well, thank you for now, but do stay for more talks. Right, now, meanwhile, in their most recent government briefing, health officials, SOA, have gone into detail about their recent decision with regard to social restrictions, right?
Right, Sunny. The latest briefing led by Health Minister Kwon Deok-cheol was focused on the easing of social distancing measures that Minjung already explained to us about. Here's more from the top health official on why it cannot be done in a more boldly manner at this point.
The nation's ICU occupancy rate is currently in the mid-60% range, and fewer than 50% of our regular hospitals are now in use. However, these figures are rising, and it's possible that we could see a greater number of severe cases, so we cannot let our guards down. This is why we've decided to ease measures gradually, as we believe there are many risks associated with a broad lifting of restrictions.
The government says it will closely monitor the trend in the number of patients that develop severe or critical symptoms until 4 weeks past the peak of the Omicron wave, including the next 2 weeks, during which newly eased social distancing measures will be in effect. Also, to reduce COVID-19 related deaths at nursing hospitals and nursing homes amid the recent increase of cluster infections at such venues, officials vowed to send patients, even with lighter symptoms, to designated COVID-19 nursing hospitals. Special teams of nurses and doctors will also be dispatched to nursing facilities to supervise the distribution of oral treatments like Paxlovid.
Right. And back on our social restrictions then, so in essence, the future fate of our restrictions will depend on the number of severe infections and fatalities then.
Exactly. And that itself, however, is not easy to predict. Yet there are many questions already streaming in as to what comes next in terms of easing social distancing measures. So people might be wondering what's actually left in terms of these measures. So according to a senior health ministry official, Son Young at the briefing earlier, he said the 3 key measures that will be under discussions in the coming weeks will be the complete lifting of business hour limits, the complete lifting of the cap on private gatherings, and the restriction on large events or rallies of more than 300 people. Mandatory mask wearing and other day-to-day prevention guidelines are also subject for discussion, but when asked about the possibility of lifting outdoor mask rules, Son hinted that rules for mask wearing may be the last ones to be scrapped, as it is one of the easiest ways to practice prevention against the virus. And for indoor venues, that even holds more true. Meanwhile, in regards to questions on possible shifts in the quarantine period for COVID-19 patients, which currently stands at 7 days, the official mentioned that is a separate issue that has to be discussed aside from the social distancing measures.
Right, I see. So have authorities addressed the possibility of rebounds and infections in light of our recent rollbacks?
Well, Sunny, the government as well as the Korea Institute of Science and Technology has revealed an analysis saying that even with the easing of restrictions, there will be a maximum increase in 10 to 20% of COVID-19 infections. And again, stressing with that social distancing measures do not work as effective as during the Delta wave during the Omicron wave now.
So simply put, we are looking ahead to changes in our COVID-19 containment strategy as long as certain tallies stay within medical capacity then?
Yes, we could say so, Sunny. And one more thing regarding changes, actually, the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters will also adjust the briefings regarding COVID-19 starting next Monday, reducing them to twice a week from the earlier 3. And that'll be Wednesday and Friday.
I see. All right, so good to know. Let's expand our talk now to include Minjung. Minjung, do tell us a bit about the upcoming research on long COVID planned by authorities here.
Right, Sunny. With 1 in 5 infected people experiencing long COVID, officials on Thursday announced they will begin investigating the long-term effects of COVID-19. Let's take a listen.
There is not enough research on the long-term effects of COVID-19 worldwide. There is a limit to treating patients or managing the virus situation with the existing studies. This is why we need more standardized and accurate data on lingering post-COVID-19 symptoms to tackle the pandemic more effectively.
According to current data from local research labs and medical centers, 20 to 79% of patients experienced fatigue, shortness of breath, and sleep and mood disorders after recovering from COVID-19. And around 19% of them visited a medical center for these reasons. However, current studies are only based on patients who had a serious illness or an underlying health condition. So to create more reliable data, authorities will be conducting studies on post-COVID symptoms on 1,000 patients, including younger and healthy people, and provide an in-depth analysis in the latter half of this year.
And adding to that, some people may even suffer for years from such long COVID symptoms. As a study conducted by Gyeongbuk National University Hospital suggests, it found that 64 out of 129 patients that had post-COVID symptoms for over a year experienced forgetfulness, fatigue, and sleep disorders even 21 months after infection. To put that into perspective, according to a survey by the US CDC, while it takes weeks for COVID-19 symptoms to disappear to the extent where people feel normal again, even in the case of young adults with no existing medical issues, more than 90% of people discharged from hospital after being treated for influenza usually recovered within 2 weeks. So basically, this suggests that even healthy people can suffer longer from COVID than people who had to be hospitalized for the seasonal flu, which likely includes people who had been immunocompromised. So it looks like the COVID-19 symptoms may continue for a longer period than the seasonal flu.
Right, well, hopefully the upcoming research here in Korea will provide us with an effective response to tackling long COVID then.
Let's hope so.
All right, so thank you very much for that coverage. Minjung, thank you. Have a safe weekend.
Thank you.
In our headlines at this hour, the U.S. is tapping into its emergency oil reserves to curb escalating energy costs amid the hosts of geopolitical uncertainties worldwide. Our Kim Yo-sun has our top story.
The White House has announced the largest release of the U.S. emergency oil reserve, calling on oil companies to pump more to bring down gas prices that have skyrocketed even more following Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Today, I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months, over 180 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is a wartime bridge to increase oil supply until production ramps up later this year. And it is by far the largest release of our national reserve in our history.
The 180 million barrel release is equivalent to about 2 days of global demand. It will more than cover oil exports to the U.S. from Russia, which President Biden had earlier banned. Following Biden's announcement, the price of the U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate slid more than 7% a barrel, while the Brent crude fell some 5.4%. He also called on Congress to make companies pay a fee if they choose not to utilize oil wells on land they've leased from the government. In addition, he also urged lawmakers to pass his plan to move the country toward clean energy policies. Regarding Russia, Biden said President Putin appears to be, quote, self-isolated, and there are indications that suggest he may have fired or put under house arrest some of his advisors as a result of Moscow's war with Ukraine. Kim Hye-san, Arirang News.
Right, and Russian President Vladimir Putin has issued a decree demanding payment for the country's natural gas in rubles as conflict continues in Ukraine. Our Kim Sung-min reports.
Amid tough economic sanctions put in place by the international community, Russian President Vladimir Putin is seeking to leverage the country's natural gas exports. Putin signed a decree on Thursday requiring, quote, unfriendly countries to pay for natural gas in rubles via Russian banks from April 1st. He added during his televised speech that existing contracts would be terminated if clients fail to comply with their obligations. Despite strong messages coming from Europe's biggest gas provider, Western companies and governments have rejected the move, saying it's a breach of contracts which are set in euros or dollars. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said he expects his country to be able to pay for Russian gas according to prior agreements, a reaction echoed by other countries like France, Britain, and the Czech Republic. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, fresh efforts are being put in place to evacuate civilians still trapped in the besieged city of Mariupol. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk said a convoy of 45 buses is headed to the city as Russia agreed to open a humanitarian corridor to Mariupol, where tens of thousands of civilians are still trapped. The operation is facing difficulties, however, as Vereshchuk added Russian troops blocked the convoy at a checkpoint. The operation was originally slated for Thursday, but is now going ahead on Friday due to logistical and security reasons. This comes as Russia is reportedly reinforcing its offensive in the Donbas region just a few days after saying it would radically scale down attacks on some parts of Ukraine. The Pentagon said Russia seemingly intends to refit and resupply its troops to redeploy them elsewhere. NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg said Russia continues to maintain pressure on Kyiv and other cities. He added that additional offensive action is expected, which could bring even more suffering. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
In other news, Korea's exports continue to defy geopolitical risk factors, with outbound shipments last month setting a fresh high driven by chips and petroleum products. Min Soo-kyun has details.
South Korea's exports in March hit a record high, marking the 17th straight month of growth. The Trade Ministry on Friday said exports last month amounted to $63.5 billion, up more than 18% on year, recording the highest ever monthly value. The growth was mostly attributed to strong demand for semiconductors and petrochemicals. Outbound shipments of semiconductors soared 38% to an all-time monthly high of more than $13 billion, while exports of petrochemicals rose nearly 15% to a record high of $5.4 billion. Other export items such as petroleum products and displays posted significant growth as well. Shipments to the country's key trading partners also increased last month. Exports to China and the U.S. rose nearly 17% and 20% respectively, while notably shipments to ASEAN countries surged over 44%, all three areas recording their biggest ever monthly values. But in the wake of the Russian-Ukraine crisis, shipments to Russia plunged by 40%, while there were hardly any exports to Ukraine. Meanwhile, soaring energy prices pushed up imports to hit a monthly record high of $63.6 billion, up almost 28% on year. The spike in imports resulted in an overall trade deficit of $140 million, a swift turnaround from the $831 million trade surplus posted the previous month. This comes as South Korea is heavily dependent on imports of energy, with imports of crude oil, gas, and coal hitting a record high of $16 billion last month. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
On a light note now, the Nam June Paik Art Center is paying tribute to the artist himself in commemoration of the 90th anniversary of his birth. Our Kim Bo-kyung was there.
The musician John Lennon called this man avant-garde. Known as the pioneer of video art, Nam June Peck was an artist who always chose a much longer journey away from familiarity and hypocrisy. Celebrating the 90th anniversary of Peck's birth, Namjoon Peck Art Center has come up with 2 special exhibitions. Archaeology of Avant-Garde shows Peck's works along with 10 photographs featuring the scenes from Peck's life, traveling back from 2000 to 1964. Peck originally dreamed of being a classical composer and was heavily influenced by Arnold Schoenberg, who was then seen as the ultimate avant-garde. Yet he also wanted to find his own artistic path. Peck is remembered as an artist who always experimented and studied new mediums and art using videos, satellites, televisions, and even lasers. That is why we label him avant-garde. Rehabilitation of Genghis Khan, which won the grand prize at the Venice Biennale 1993, shows visitors how Peck saw himself as a nomad like the Mongolians. And visitors can see how much Peck also sought to make radical changes in music by having artists play violins that had been pulled out of the water.
Why can there be a video synthesizer? That is the question that popped up in Peck's head. Just like a DJ mixing sounds, the Peck Abe video synthesizer modulates colors and presents shuffled images filmed by cameras.
Another exhibition is a rendition of Peck's music score to the Symphony for 20 Rooms. Peck composed this score in 1961, but it could not be performed while he was alive. Rather than notes or scales, the score depicts 16 rooms with several instructions on a paper. He assigned various sounds, objects, and devices for each square, and with the help of 7 contemporary artists, each square has been unfolded as a viewable score.
Based on Peck's instructions written on the text score, each room displays music stimulating not only the eyes and ears, but also the sense of smell.
As visitors make their own sounds using devices, the overall sound continuously changes depending on who turns the pages of the score and how they operate the devices. The curator says perhaps that is the reason why there were only 16 squares on the paper instead of the 20 rooms mentioned in the title, leaving the rest of the symphony to be completed by its audience. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. During a high-level pledging conference on Thursday, the UN had called for $4.4 billion for humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. However, donor countries pledged just over $2.4 billion. Some of the donors include the United States, the European Union, and the UK, who had strongly criticized the Taliban decision to deny girls secondary education. Earlier in the day, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres had called for donors to provide unconditional funding, adding that 9 million Afghans faced famine, with families selling children and organs to survive. Humanitarian situation has worsened significantly since the Taliban takeover last August, with the economy there on the brink of a complete collapse. A massive fire in southern Chile has burned up to 80 hectares of land, while destroying at least 40 homes late Wednesday. Locals from the town of Laguna Verde were seen alongside firefighters trying to put out the fire as authorities worked to prevent the fire from advancing towards residential areas. Some pockets of the fire were still active Thursday, as strong winds and steep ravines made it difficult to control the blaze. Valparaiso in 2014 saw one of the worst fires in the country's history, with over 800 hectares burned, 2,500 buildings destroyed, and the lives of 15 people lost. Blue Origin's New Shepard spacecraft completed its 4th flight with a crew on Thursday, returning successfully to West Texas after taking half a dozen passengers for a 10-minute suborbital joyride. The flight came 2 days later than scheduled, as poor weather conditions forced the mission to be postponed earlier this week. While Saturday Night Live star Pete Davidson was supposed to be one of the passengers on board the latest flight, he dropped out earlier this month and was replaced by Gary Lai, the architect behind New Shepard's reusable launch system. NASA scientists have discovered the most distant star ever recorded and have named it Earendel, an Old English word meaning morning star. Using the Hubble Space Telescope, researchers described the star as being blue in color and estimated it to be 50 to 100 times the mass of our sun, while being millions of times brighter. Its light traveled for 12.9 billion years before reaching Earth, meaning that the star existed when the universe was just 7% of its current known age. Until now, the most distant star on record was Icarus, which is known to have existed 4 billion years after Earendel. 이 승재, 아리랑 뉴스.
Come April 17th, pre-arrival COVID-19 test requirements for international travellers to Australia will be lifted. For more, I have Professor Sanjaya Senanayake at the Australian National University live on the line. Professor Senanayake, it's been quite a while since we last spoke. Welcome back.
Thank you, Sunny. Good to be back.
Right. Professor, let's start with some background information behind this upcoming ease in border restriction into Australia.
Yes, so Australia really for most of the last 2 and a bit years has had her borders closed. So it has really been an impenetrable fortress for people trying to get into Australia. But that started to change at the end of last year. And it's been gradually changing to the point where if you have a negative PCR, it's much easier to come in these days. And by April 17th, you won't even need to have a PCR evidence of not having COVID. Just 2 doses of vaccine on a vaccine certificate, and you can come into Australia.
Right. Professor, meanwhile, I hear a number of variants, including the stealth Omicron and the so-called Delta clone, have been detected in Australia. Could you tell us a bit more about their emergence there?
Look, the most dominant strain in Australia right now, which is dominating our landscape, is the stealth Omicron, so BA2. And that comes after December, where we saw a big surge in cases due to Omicron. So prior to Omicron in December, after almost 2 years of the pandemic, we only had about 200,000 cases. Now we've got well over 4 million documented cases, and that's mainly due to Omicron, but now to BA2 or the stealth Omicron variant. However, thankfully, in terms of disease severity and hospitalizations, BA2, the stealth Omicron variant, does not seem to be any more severe than Omicron, which is good news. And the oral antiviral medications like Paxlovid and Molnupiravir seem to work just as effectively against it as they did against Omicron.
Right. So, Professor Senanayake, simply speaking, the emergence of these particular variants have not really affected containment efforts there then?
No, it hasn't. We were worried because we do know that BA2, or this Omicron stealth variant, is 1.4 times more transmissible than Omicron. So it's certainly more infectious and more people can get sick. And even though it's less severe, the concern was with more people being sick, that would eventually lead to more people being in hospital. But touch wood, we haven't seen that so far. So that's been very good news.
Right. And Professor, I understand Australia is poised to roll out its second booster dose starting this month. That would be April. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular plan?
So this comes in the context of heading into winter in Australia and knowing that we haven't had a big influenza season for the last 2 years. So that potentially means that we might have a very big influenza season this year. And as COVID is a respiratory virus like influenza, it is also likely to surge. And we're very concerned about what could happen if the 2 viruses are circulating together. So if people are getting, particularly if people are getting flu and COVID at the same time, there's certainly some animal data suggesting that the levels of flu virus in you can be amplified by doing that. So we want to try and target the most vulnerable people over 65, those in nursing homes and those with low immune systems, and offer them a 4th dose or a second booster of vaccine, while at the same time encouraging everyone to get their influenza vaccine.
Right. And moving forward, Professor, what are your thoughts on the prospects of reinfection amid a prolonged pandemic?
Well, as we saw with Omicron, we saw large proportions of people, particularly initially in South Africa, where Omicron was first identified, where people who'd been infected in different waves of their pandemic, so the 3 prior waves, got reinfected with Omicron. So if new variants appear with these immune escape mechanisms, then we can definitely see reinfections. And the best way to protect ourselves against reinfections and hospitalization from reinfections is to make sure our vaccinations are up to date. And we've potentially, in the second half of this year, we'll have trial data from Moderna and Pfizer about their vaccines that specifically target Omicron, and that may be something we could look at in the second half of the year.
Right, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for that, of course. Meanwhile, aside from vaccination, Professor, we also have antiviral treatment pills against COVID-19. Having said that, what are your words of advice with regard to the use of these oral treatment options?
Right. So the good news with Omicron and BA2, as I mentioned earlier, is that these new oral antivirals like Paxlovid and Molnupiravir seem to be unaffected by the change in those variants from Delta to Omicron and to BA2. So that's really good news. The way we're using them in Australia, we're still offering them to not everyone, but to people who are at high risk of hospitalization. So people who are early in their COVID illness, who've only got mild COVID, but have those risk factors that put them at a high risk of getting to hospital, such as immunosuppression, bad lungs, bad hearts, etc. And I think they have a very big role to play. Will there be enough supply for us to offer it to everyone with COVID? And can we really justify in giving it to everyone with COVID, particularly healthy young people? That's still to be seen.
Right, that is true. All right, Professor Sinaniake over in Australia, thank you very much for making the time to join us live at this hour with your thoughts.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Health authorities say Korea's Omicron wave is retreating. Accordingly, social restrictions are being eased, while plans are in the works to enhance protection among the elderly as we seek to move forward in our fight against COVID-19. For more, I have Dr. Kim Seung-taek from Institute Pasteur Korea. Dr. Kim, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
I also have Professor Lee Sang from Yonsei University. Professor Lee, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you for having me today.
Professor, Dr. Kim, that is Korea past the worst of the Omicron wave, do you think?
Well, I want to be very just careful before saying that we actually just passed over the peak. But some numbers, very just some key numbers, such as like a basic reproduction number, sometimes called an R0 or R0. That number actually suggests that we are actually just passing the peak just case numbers. So this is quite just promising. But for we can actually just suggest maybe some short-term projection and the long-term projection of COVID-19. And then in the case of the short-term, just the period, these days we are actually experiencing very explosive infection. So, which means that in addition to just previous very wide just vaccination effort in our just country, but some other unvaccinated people now are just getting just immunity by the natural infection. So the short-term projection is now so many people are just get immunity against some potential just maybe some reinfection or other the viruses. So in the short term, we will just see some decreasing number of COVID-19 cases. But for the long term, the cases are a little bit just tricky. One of the things is that we do not know whether any other different kind of just the variant might just emerge. And also we have to also consider our just immune status. There are two different aspects of immune status. One is just humoral immunity. This is basically just antibody just production. And the second one is the cellular immunity. But this antibody is actually present in our body is actually just gradually just decrease over the couple of or just several just a month. So in the end, this antibody, the present in our body, will just decrease. Then we will somehow will be just vulnerable to reinfection in the future. But the good thing is that our just cellular immunity, which is actually conferred by the so-called T cell, is very robust and long-lasting. So my guess is that we will see maybe some increase of some increasing COVID-19 in the future, long-term, some future, but probably just a smaller number of severe cases.
Right, hopefully then. Professor E, there has been quite a bit of debate about the practicality of restricting business hours at drinking and dining establishments as part of efforts to curb the spread of COVID-19. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think recently the merit of the restriction I think has gone down somewhat, and I think there is quite a valid reason I think for reducing the level of restrictions. But I think the important aspect is the speed and the magnitude of the reduction in the restrictions. So I would be still a little bit careful to lift everything up at all of a sudden because when people are interacting way much more than current level to up to some level, then still we are seeing some of the transmission that is still going on, and a breakthrough infection is still possible. So while it is probably the time that we have to recognize the reduction of the merit of the restriction, but still in terms of lifting up in a wholesome way, I think I would be a little bit careful.
Right. And Dr. Kim, it has been said that Omicron is relatively milder in nature compared to other variants. Having said that, how do you explain, though, the tragic numbers of losses of lives, that is, related to COVID-19 here in the country?
Well, that's actually, it's not an easy question to just answer. And then the government said that maybe just some underlying medical conditions maybe just play a major role, because those people are just intrinsically very vulnerable people without even just some COVID-19. So there might be some other explanation, but some people say that this is very just special, especially in Korea, because in other foreign countries and in the very early years of the pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic, many people have actually, people with some high risk, like an elderly group and the underlying medical condition, they have already died. But in Korea, because of the very efficient quarantine procedure and the social distancing, we are very successful just maintaining the very low level of COVID-19 cases. So that might a little bit of can explain why we are seeing now a little bit more of a fatality compared to other countries.
Professor, authorities are planning to conduct yet another antibody testing. What do you suppose is the importance of this testing at this particular point in our fight against COVID-19?
So this, as for this large-scale antibody testing of about 10,000 people, I think it can be a valid step to establish the population serological prevalence level so that we can have a more scientific ground about how to approach this situation and what is the level of the people's immunity in the population. But still there is some concern, and I would be still also careful because conducting antibody testing on 10,000 people at very limited amount of time, it is just a large scale of operation in itself. So conducting the study in very valid way, in very scientific way, it will be probably necessary to have a quite good designing of the studies and quite good preparation. So to have a valid result of these studies, I would be a little bit careful hastening the study in very limited amount of time.
Right, because it's a daunting task in itself.
Sure.
Dr. Kim, the Wall Street Journal, as my colleagues mentioned earlier, claims Korea has the world's lowest COVID-19 fatality and has forecast that the country may be among the first to usher in an endemic phase of the pandemic. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the very small number just fatality, that's actually just the accounts of our just efforts for the last 2 years. And then the reason is that, well, just as of now, the number one the reason for that is that our high just vaccination rate now is just more than 85% of vaccination. That's really high. And then now just although it's not, the supply is not really just sufficient, but we have somehow tried to very efficiently use the oral drugs that is now available. And then the Paxlovid now just we are just approved the molnupiravir, and so that might be another just alternative option for the treating just a patient with some high risk group, high risk. And then before the vaccination, just earlier pandemic, maybe year 2020, before just the vaccine is available. Now Korea was very just successful in just a quarantine procedure and then maintaining very good social distancing guidelines. So that's why now we have seen just very low number, number of just fatality, and then that's actually just expressing why. And then for the this low just fatality means that maybe we are as this journal indicates that we are maybe just coming near to the some endemic phase, maybe so-called living with just COVID-19.
Right. And Professor, on the vaccination front, what do you suppose is the importance of a second booster dose despite the declining trend in Omicron infections here in the country?
So second booster dose or the fourth shot had been conducted in countries like Israel, and also in the United States, even the President Biden has gotten the fourth shot, the second booster shots. So I think there can be some of the valid reason because the immunity can wane as the time passes. The first shot it has been quite a while since many of the people has gotten the first shots, but as for its usage and its effectiveness for the general population, I would be a little bit careful, I think. As for people with reduced immunity, people with immunocompromised conditions, people who are in age above 75 years old, or people with underlying conditions who are very old, maybe it can be a valid approach to have fourth shots so that to keep the immunity. But right now we are passing the peak prevalence of the incidence of the COVID-19 cases in the country, and compared to many other countries and in the United States or other nations, we have quite a low level of the case fatality rate. So maybe for some limited group of the populations with certain conditions, maybe we can, I think, recommend the fourth shot or second booster shots. But for the general population, I think it's a little bit early to call for the general fourth booster shot vaccination for the general population.
So for the general population, we need to wait and see then?
I would go that, yeah.
Right. Dr. Kim, what guidelines do you recommend for in the case of second booster shots for the public?
Well, just the Professor Lee said, there are some controversial issues in the U.S. The government decision on some approval of the first shot. The first one is, so far as I know, there is no, so far as no scientific justification. And then there was no just advisory committee meeting. That was actually usually just happened just previously. And then in terms of just ages, I mean, to be just eligible for the fourth shot it's a little bit different. The Pfizer ones just applied for the some approval for the fourth shot for the people with the 65 years of age, but then now the U.S. government actually just approved for the people above the 50 years of age. But then one of the main just evidence that this U.S. government actually just judges upon this fourth shot is the Israeli study. But in that study, a certain group of people got actually benefit by the fourth shot, but those groups are actually the people with the age of 60 years of age. So ages are really different, and then there's not actually enough just the explanation for why the age of the 50 it was actually selected by the U.S. government right now, and then that's why there's some some debate on this one. And in terms of in Korea side, well, as the professor just Lee said, I think we have to actually just observe what actually other foreign countries actually experiencing, like Israel Israel and the US. And then if there is any some benefit is actually demonstrated solidly, then we might just actually just think about just the fourth shot. I mean the booster shot, not for some general just the people, but for the people with the high risk groups and then some elderly people. And then for the some other maybe some future the vaccination procedure, we actually keep in mind that several recent study results. The first one is several weeks ago, I think the group of scientists actually tested the Moderna vaccines for the some Omicron, and one is actually that very special for this study is that they actually tested the some non-human primate. This non-human primate already has already just experienced 2 shots like the humans. So the first 2 shots was just a regular, just Moderna, just the vaccine, but then to test whether it's Omicron specific, the vaccine works just better than the some original vaccine. So then those scientists actually give us the third shot. One of the primate group actually received the original the Moderna just the vaccine, and the other group actually received the some Omicron variant specific vaccine. So the original rationale is among the many scientists there's maybe variant specific vaccine would be much efficacious compared to some original vaccine. But in the end, what they found out is that there was no differences. At least, and this is not the human trial, but in the non-human primate study, there was no any superior efficacy compared to the original vaccine. So now we can may just ask a question whether variant-specific the vaccine is really just beneficial or not. And then the next study is that this is actually what we actually talked about the first shot, so-called the second boost shot is whether it's beneficial for some general public. But then there was at least the data to show that there's not much just a benefit compared to the first shot between just the third shot, the 3-shot program, and then the fourth shot program. So so far there is no just a specific. I mean, there is no just a specific recommendation for the fourth shot. And then for some long-term projection for our everybody is actually curious about what will happen in our future in terms of vaccination, whether we'll get some very repeated vaccination over maybe for upcoming several years or not. But I think practically, getting the vaccination like every 4 months or 5 months or like 6 months, it's not really just practical. So then the main practical thing is that the people are suggesting maybe just an annual shot program, like some flu shot. There might be some probably just acceptable for the general public. And then another opinion is that some people actually argue that we have actually experiencing some other endemic coronaviruses. Those coronaviruses, some of the coronavirus looks a little bit just fatal in the very long time ago. But now this is endemic and then causing very mild cold symptoms. So that this is the case that we will just maybe experience in the future. So that the thing is that maybe. Instead of just getting just a regular booster shot, maybe what about just any variant? I mean, we might just keep being exposed to the current viruses or any other emerging the variants. So then at least now we have some immunity by the some vaccination or like any natural infection. So this immunity will actually protect us at least from just progressing to the severe diseases. So then maybe repeated exposure to the variant will actually play as just a booster shot instead of getting the booster vaccine in itself.
Right. So the exposure to variants itself might actually protect us from COVID-19. Yeah. Professor, starting yesterday, that was Thursday, children aged 5 to 11 here in the country are now eligible for COVID-19 vaccinations. As a doctor yourself, what are your thoughts on vaccinations for children?
I think especially as the school has started now, to keep the school open, I think it's quite nice to have the vaccine available as an option for the children. As for requiring the vaccine, maybe we can be a little bit more careful because even though the children in that age group, even though they contract COVID, the symptom is quite relatively mild. So if we consider the benefit and any possible risk of side effect, then maybe it is not. It is a little bit. We can be on the more safer side not to require vaccine for everyone, but as the COVID-19 transmission is still ongoing and children are all exposed for the infection at the moment, and if we have enough number of children who are contracting COVID-19, then there will be some of the children who might be developing some of the severe cases, and even the proportion is very small. When enough number of size of children are contracting COVID-19 infection, then the absolute number of those children with a more severe symptom can increase as well. So I think it is really nice to still have the vaccine available, and I would recommend people, if there are any parents who are considering vaccines, I would recommend the vaccinations. And also another aspect is it had been the vaccination for children in this age group had been performed in many other countries already. So, and the safety record is quite proven, and we can quite confidently say that it is very safe vaccines. So I would recommend, and also especially for children who have diabetes or any kind of chronic lung conditions or heart conditions, for those children, if they contract the COVID-19 infections, the symptom possibly can be very severe as well. So especially for those children with those conditions, I would really strongly recommend the vaccinations. But for the general public and general school children, to keep school open and to be on the more safer side, I think it is really valid recommendation to have the vaccination for those children in those age group.
Right, I see. And finally, Dr. Kim, this will be an impromptu question for you. There is much talk about downgrading the country's COVID-19 risk level from 1 to 2. Having said that, when do you believe would be an appropriate time to downgrade our alert level?
Well, I think first we have to look into the what kind of just virus or pathogens actually belong to the some class 1 or class 2, and then I have not looked into that very details, but I think when the this COVID-19 infection, the risk of COVID-19 infection is now just down to the decreases down to the like influenza virus infection, then we can actually do something like that.
Right, I see. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for that then. All right, Dr. Kim, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts today. Professor, thank you for being with us with your thoughts. And on that note, we say goodbye for this week. We'll be back with more coverage next Monday. See you then. Have a safe weekend.